Hi everyone. So today, welcome to the next episode of Geopolitika, and today we'll be discussing global governance and international organizations. Very interesting subject, no doubt. Here we have Jason Giardino with us. Welcome, Jason, our co-host.
Thanks, Ro.
So basically, what is global governance? We're talking about trying to answer the age-old question: who's running the show, who's controlling international affairs, who's running the world. And many of us assume that it's democratic institutions, our democratically elected governments. Obviously, in some countries, they don't have governments that are not democratically elected, but the democratic process, the democratization process, has been in full swing at least since 1945, on paper. However, in reality, to what extent are our elected leaders, governments, parliaments across the world, and regional governments, like European Union, for example, and other organizations, how much are they responsible for dictating policies and implementing policies? Is it really a system of global governance which is based upon democratic structures? Or do we have other very powerful influences that are calling the shots, or largely calling the shots, when it comes to global governance? This is really the essence of our discussion today. So maybe, Jason, we can start off by talking about one of the major international organizations that was set up in 1921. And this led to what is referred to today as the Council on Foreign Relations. So maybe we could pull up our first clip to give a bit of an idea as to what we are talking about. This was actually set up very much with the support of the Rockefeller family in 1921. The idea had started off with President Wilson in the United States, who wanted a team of advisors, and they were being spearheaded by one of his top advisors within his government. And this was in order to try to formulate international policy subsequent to World War I. So it started actually around 1918, 1919. The team had gone to Europe in order to try to have some influence on the new Europe, as it were, or the world order that was coming out of World War I. It didn't quite go the way President Wilson had hoped, because he had published what he referred to and the world referred to as the 14 points. And this was, the 14 points are referring to his vision of global governance following World War I. And this eventually gave rise to the Council on Foreign Relations. They are very influential to this very day. Who are they? They are a team of people from the political sector, but also from the finance sector, from media, from big business, from industry. But these are not democratically elected organizations. It's not like when you have maybe an organization that has its members and then the members vote for its leadership. They are something outside of the democratic structures. There's another organization which is referred to as the Bilderberg Group. We can bring up the next clip here. The Bilderberg Group was set up in 1954, at least that's when it had its first meeting. And very similar to the Council of Foreign Relations, it's a bit of a closed club. Who gets to attend these meetings? These meetings are very secretive, because what is said at these meetings is not publicized. They might issue papers afterwards, but what is discussed and who is actually giving suggestions is not discussed at all. These things are being discussed behind closed doors. And essentially, the Bilderberg Group is pretty secretive, just as the Council of Foreign Relations is secretive. And those persons attending would be attending by invitation.
And usually, Rudolf, in organizations like the Bilderberg Group, you often have what's called hierarchical compartmentalization. So certain members will be at certain meetings, but other higher-ranking, long-standing officials within that organization will be at more secretive meetings that the other low-ranking officials will not be at. So it's very compartmentalized in that regard.
Yes, completely. Yes, I mean, they work on a number of papers, and the people lower down would be working on those papers, but the policies at the very top would be dictated literally from the top. So it begs the obvious question, when they are actually inviting media personalities to these organizations' meetings, what exactly are the representatives of the media doing? Because they're not acting as watchdogs, because they're bound to secrecy.
That's right.
So they are going into these meetings. They might either be just listening, possibly being given ideas of what policies they need to follow themselves as media. Or they might be contributing by giving suggestions, etc., or discussions at certain levels, as you said. But essentially, the policies are dictated from above down below. And many of the persons attending are also within the political structures, from governments, parliaments, etc. But they are appearing in their personal capacities.
Yes.
And this begs the obvious question, is there not a conflict of interest? Because essentially, if you are a government official, you should not be bound by secrecy in a meeting which is being steered by an international organization which is not a governmental structure,
Yes.
which is being pushed by industry. So this again begs the obvious question, who is actually taking the decisions that are impacting our world? The people who are at the top of these organizations like Bilderberg, Council of Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission, which again was set up by the Rockefellers in the 1970s. Who is actually dictating policy?
And a good portion of the members of these organizations, like CFR and the Trilateral Commission, are long-standing politicians who have been who are part of presidential administrations, whether it be Republican or Democrat, throughout the decades. So you will have some members within these organizations who have been part of Nixon's administration and still are guiding presidents as we speak today. For example, Henry Kissinger, he's been a long-standing member of these organizations. He's been part of a presidential administration since we can remember.
Yes, exactly. James Baker is another one. He was a very prominent politician at the time of when the Berlin Wall came down, and there was a new hope in the air of a new wave of freedom. And in fact, it was James Baker who had gone public saying that NATO, for example, would not move 1 inch eastward if the Iron Curtain would come down and the Berlin Wall would come down, and Eastern Europe would be allowed its freedom as of course it should have been allowed. But that was part of the quid pro quo. And these people like James Baker are still behind the scenes, if not necessarily going to the meetings, but a lot of their policies are still being pushed. Well, of course, there's also the Trilateral Commission, which we mentioned. It started in the mid-70s, and they have various focuses. Some would be focusing on relations between the United States and Europe, for example, as would be the Council of Foreign Relations, whereas the Trilateral Commission is bringing the United States, Europe, and mostly Japan to move towards common policies. Now, we're all in favor of common policies, but how are they being taken, and what actually is the agenda? Is it really an agenda which is bringing the world together in harmony, in peace and harmony, in trade relations, etc., for the betterment of society as a whole, the global society, the so-called global village? Or is it being spearheaded by big business,
As a
which
power
in
grab.
fact it is, which obviously has its own agenda? This is really the big question. So this global governance, is it really about us, the people, we, the people of the world? Or is it being dictated to from on high, not by politicians we are electing ourselves, though they might be participating in these organizations, but they're participating not in their capacities.
It seems to be
but
going
in their personal capacities, not in their official governmental capacities.
It seems to be going towards an unholy trinity between politicians, corporations, and these non-governmental organizations like Trilateral Commission and so forth.
Well, I think there's always been a problem, essentially, of a struggle between the democratic forces and those forces that are not being elected in society, but consider themselves as deserving of having a major say in society. And so we're talking about global organizations, multinational organizations, supranational organizations. The mergers that have been going on the last 20, 30 years have been absolutely flabbergasting.
Absolutely.
There was a time when these mergers were not being allowed because they were considered to be infringing laws regarding
monopolies,
free and fair competition.
Yes.
If you grew too large, for example, even the Rockefeller organizations, which one of them was the oil company they
Standard
had,
Oil.
Standard Oil, had grown so large that it was considered to have a monopoly, and therefore they had to split it up. They split up this monopoly. But today,
we're going in reverse.
You've got the opposite happening. You've got the mega mergers, as we know. Whether you look at
media,
big media, or you look at the online, the social media,
healthcare
powers, healthcare, insurance. I mean, you're always talking about maybe half a dozen major players in the world, not half a dozen in one country. So when Standard Oil was broken up, it was considered to have too much power within the United States, not even globally, just one country. A large country, fair enough, but it was one country. Today, a handful of organizations are so powerful that they have mega influence, cornering the market within their specific sector globally. And this is the so-called globalization, which unfortunately a lot of leaders across the world have been singing the praise of globalization like it's a really good thing. Those who criticize it are considered to be radicals,
censored, being censored,
and very often censored. So if there's an anti-global demonstration which is peaceful and is trying to bring a message through, that message doesn't come through because the media doesn't cover it. There'd be a couple of incidents, maybe, and violence, and that is what is actually focused upon by the media, as though the anti-global movement in the world
is some radical
who are just extremists, interested in violence, which is not the case at all. But unfortunately,
that's how they're being branded.
That is how they're being branded. I think this is why it is important to have a program, an episode of this program specifically on this subject, on globalization specifically, and global governance. Because unfortunately, I think a lot of us in the world are still under the impression that a lot of the decisions are being made by governments, and they are not being made by governments. They're being made by the globalists who are non-elected leaders, who are influencing unduly our elected leaders.
What's happening is these changes are coming in incrementally, which makes it very insidious because you can't see them coming, but they're there. And so when you do small changes incrementally, before you know it, you've lost your democracy, you've lost your sovereignty, you've lost your constitutional law, and even we can see this going forward. We see many nations are starting to disregard their constitutions in favor of this global type of governance, whether it be in healthcare, whether it be geopolitically. So it's always incrementally. Obviously, big governments cannot impose legislation in one fell swoop because there would be too much pushback. So they do it incrementally so that the people kind of get used to it. You know, as you boil a frog, you boil it slowly and not in one shot.
Yes, that's exactly the the thing that comes to mind. The proverbial frog in hot water. As the temperature starts to rise, it tries to adapt, doesn't realize what's going on until, of course, it's too late.
That's right.
And I think this is what is happening with us global citizens. It's working incrementally, as you said, and unless people are aware on a much larger scale that there's a very surreptitious attack on our own democratic institutions.
And it can be very daunting for most people because when they come to realize what's actually happening, they realize that, wait a minute here, I'm losing, my rights. I'm losing what I thought was my democratically right to vote and to determine policy. When really those policies slowly are coming from higher orders and not from democratically elected politicians.
Yes. I think people are becoming increasingly frustrated that they are being disenfranchised from a democratic point of view in terms of public participation the decision-making process.
And we can even see that locally with the increase in the non-voting rates in the last elections, for example, and here in Malta as well. You can see it globally.
Yes, it is very serious. I mean, to give a bit of a banal example by way of analogy, imagine you're into soccer and your stadiums aren't filling up. You realize that there's a crisis, right? Because your followers are no longer following you. They're not there. The same thing if you're organizing a concert and people don't come, you say there's a major crisis.
You got a problem with your product.
You got a problem, right? So the most important product for us, in fact, is the so-called product, is the democratic process.
Cool.
And if people are stepping out of that because they're feeling disenfranchised, they're feeling disempowered, that's a major problem. I remember the European Union had launched a questionnaire of sorts, or an invitation to the European citizens to give feedback to the Commission about what they considered to be important and how to improve the democratic process, etc. But quite honestly, just giving out this questionnaire, how effective could something like that be? Let's face it. Because when you know that there are a lot of decisions that are taking place behind closed doors, a lot of our leaders are going to meetings of the Bilderberg Group, of the Council of Foreign Relations, of the Trilateral Commission, and now the one that has been most in the forefront, the World Economic Forum.
Cool.
I mean, I think many people know that it exists. They might not know much about it, but again, it's just another international organization where they tend to meet at least once a year in Davos, in Switzerland. I believe there are about 5,000 security officials to protect these people in Davos. And who are these people? They're coming from big business. Members of big media are being invited, social media. Politicians are being invited. But what they discuss is secret.
It's secret.
Even though media officials are being invited, but they are sworn to secrecy.
Cool.
I'm sorry. What sort of media are you? If you agree to attending a meeting of an international organization and you're bound to secrecy. This is where policies are being discussed, determined, and they are being dictated all the way down the line, including to our governments.
And what's important to consider is that when we have policy or legislation which is being implemented from the top down, we have to ask how nuanced is that legislation, and how practical is it for the actual people of sovereign nations for them? So if it's just broad-based legislation based on some global perspective, we have to think: is this really the type of legislation that we want? Because it's not. Surely it won't be suitable for every person within their sovereign state. What's good for the Spaniards are not necessarily good for the Maltese, and so on and so forth. But if it's coming from the top down, then these type of policies are not really based in some level of humanity, but more of corporate governance structure, as it were.
Well, yes. So imagine we've had problems, for example, with the UK wanting to leave the European Union, for example, and there was a mega debate there. You have the situation with Catalonia wanting to leave Spain because they felt they didn't have enough autonomy.
Right.
Of course, we know there was a problem in eastern Ukraine. They were not being given the autonomy that they desired, and so on and so forth. So even on a national level, people are feeling disenfranchised. And then when you bring nations together, don't get me wrong, I consider myself a Europhile. I voted for Malta to be integrated in the European Union, to be a member of the European Union, because I believe it has a lot of potential. But is the European Union today, 2023, the European Union we knew 20 years ago?
Is it really reflective of the wishes of its citizens of its member states?
Well, this is a problem. And how much power does the European Parliament have? I mean, at least we get to elect European members of the European Parliament. But we don't get to have a say with the European Commission. But the European Commission, which is, you could say, the de facto government, the executive arm of the European Union, is dictating to the European Parliament. And the European Parliament has very limited powers.
Only to vote yes or no.
Well, it doesn't really have much. It's a problem. It's a major problem. I mean, even when the European commissioners are being appointed, fine, they have to be endorsed and supported by the European Parliament. But ultimately, they're not actually being appointed by the Parliament itself. The Parliament chooses whether they would endorse the appointment of the Commission. So really, again, back to the essential question: how much is there global governance? Which is based upon the democratic process. An interesting point came in here in our comments section regarding someone stated that we've been called useless eaters in a book called The Committee of 300, written by Dr. John Coleman. Well, that Committee of 300 book is very interesting because it does mention that the globalization process, the international organizations that are dictating so much global policy, obviously in their interests, and dictating it to our leaders, is made up of ultimately a committee of 300 of the most powerful people in the world. These powerful people are members or owners, if you wish, of the most powerful companies in the world. Essentially, the billionaires, the so-called billionaires club. We're not talking about millionaires. Millionaires, there are thousands of them in the world, possibly hundreds of thousands of them, maybe millions. But the billionaires consider that they should have a major stake in the decision-making process in the world. And how different is this to the situation before French Revolution, the American Revolution, when the democratic process was really in its infancy? How different is it today to the pre-French Revolution, where you didn't really have a democratic process for centuries?
And it's quite ironic when you think about it that these individuals who made their fortunes within a system of democracy are now claiming that they, because of their wealth, are in certain positions greater than others to dictate that we actually change the system that we once had. I think it's rather ironic.
Yes, well, some of them could also be old wealth, because a lot of the members of the Committee of 300 are actually very old families, going back to the Venetian bankers, going back to the aristocracy, the royal families of Europe, and so on.
Legacy empires.
So they are hanging on to power, as it were. And then you have the so-called nouveau riche, the new merchant class, as it were, that started to
social media.
Well, I mean, if you look at the 18th and 19th century, it was a rising power, but they didn't really have much power. And in fact, the American and French revolutions were being spearheaded largely by the nouveau riche. This is how there was a change in the power structure, because the National Assembly was made up of three major powers at the time: by the merchant class, by the clergy, and by the aristocracy. And the French Revolution managed to make some progress in the time of the French Revolution, because the clergy actually did start siding with the merchant class to take more power and to reduce the power of the nobility. And that's really how it started. So today you have the same story all over again, history repeating itself. Yep. You've got the billionaires, the so-called nouveau riche, who feel that they're the new royalty. And of course you have the old royalty who are clinging to their power as well. Yes. So they're coming together. And is it true, as John Coleman said, that they consider us useless eaters?
Just to put a little bit of perspective on that comment, because many people consider it to be a rather derogatory term, and obviously in a way it is, but to put it into a little bit more clarity, that term is being used because they are starting to realize now that with the advancement of technology and artificial intelligence, there's going to be a lot of people globally who are going to be out of work because they're not going to be able, a lot of this technology will be taking up the jobs that were once considered to be blue collar or white collar, what have you. And so all of these millions and billions of people not able to learn how to program or to code, they're going to be out of work. And so in that regard, they are going to be, in a way, useless eaters because they're going to be taking up the Earth's resources without the ability to advance or to get jobs and to feed themselves. So it's going to be on, the onus is going to be on the state, the individual sovereign states, to feed these people because they won't have any jobs to fall on.
Well, this, I think, is a major issue in itself, because, of course, it is a very derogatory term, calling people useless.
Yes, of course.
Because that defines, I mean, the meaning of life of the individual.
But only useless to, in respect to the new economy going forward.
Exactly. Yeah. Yes, exactly. So, I mean, if you imagine you're a company, you're heading a company, and you have a certain number of staff, and you feel that because the market has changed, you're overstaffed. So as far as you're concerned, from a company policy point of view, you have a useless number of staff. So you lay them off. So you're thinking always in economic terms, not in humanitarian terms, in social terms. You see? Because you're looking blindly from an economic perspective.
That's right.
So these persons, we spoke about the largest organizations, these transnational organizations. It's not even accurate to say that there are maybe, well, we talked about Committee of 300. Let's say there are a couple of hundred very powerful organizations, but or other companies, the transnational corporations. But these companies are actually owned by the same families. The very same families. Again, we don't need to go into names of specific companies here. But anyone who does a bit of research on any search engine is going to realize that these mergers and the persons who own certain investment companies are investing in all these major companies. So we think that they are separate, but actually the people who are pulling the strings at the top are literally a handful. Well, by a handful, let's say a couple of hundred, as we said, maybe 200 or 300 persons.
That's it.
Who would not actually be 200 or 300 different family dynasties. We're talking about possibly 100 family dynasties.
With members thereof.
With about 2 or 3 or 4 members within that family dynasty. The family dynasties intermarry, like the old nobility used to intermarry. So it's a power grabbing or a power sharing exercise. And within those, say, 100 families, you would have maybe a dozen of them that are at the very top.
And do you suspect that maybe it is this change in the paradigm where technology is becoming so advanced that the jobs which we have now will become scarce, that this idea of useless eaters is possibly scaring the people at the very top? Whereas, if you can't eat, you're going to revolt. So if we have billions of people without a job, maybe this threatens the power structure, the current power structure, and maybe that is why they decided to move away from a democratic-based political system and more towards a top-down based system.
I think this brings us to the second part of this episode, actually, exactly, because if you've got a democratic process and people feel that they're being disenfranchised, then they're going to take action to remedy the situation. But if you're moving the goalposts economically, and you see that the way you want to take the world with the stepping up of AI and a lot of technological process, which is going to maximize profits for the companies at the top, then you're going to have a major social problem. And by social problem, we're not just talking about a socioeconomic, that people might, there wouldn't be enough jobs for people to go around. Because, of course, a job is the fulcrum of, let's say, without it, how do you pay for school bills?
There's no family life.
How do you give yourself a sense of meaning?
D'accord.
Because some people might say, listen, okay, I don't need a job and I'm going to go off and I'm going to just learn and travel and meditate and I don't feel I need to have a job and I'll see how I'll get by. But most people who would lose their job, it's a major dent in their, not just in their lifestyles, not from an economic situation only, but also from a level of self-respect and a level
well-being.
of well-being and self-confidence. And you forget that the importance of that social component, that people feel that they need to be able to participate in society in that way. And I think the second part of this program, actually, we should focus on this specifically. What is actually happening in the world today regarding a change in the economic structures? Because anyone who's looked around has come across the expression New World Order. It's been around for many, many years. And now if we go to the clip we have regarding what the Trilateral Commission, one of the presidents, it's clip number 4, said at a meeting in India only very recently, just a few days ago. It's interesting that the person who was speaking actually referred to the year we have, now we are in today, 2023, as being as year one, the first year in the new economic order. Now, new economic order, new world order. Is there a difference? In a world of globalization, the new economic order is a new world order because everything is globalized economically, it's so globalized politically, socially, etc. We see this. Why are they talking about a new economic order exactly? And why has Klaus Schwab, who is running the World Economic Forum, written and published a book about the Great Reset?
Yes, this term, the Great Reset, people think that it's some type of conspiracy theory, but they've actually, the book has been written by by Klaus Schwab.
About 7 years ago.
Yes, the details of their intended policy are out in the public. This is not, it's fact. It's not a conspiracy theory.
Well, unfortunately, we know from what we've already said that a lot of the media representatives, the big media, are invited to these international organizations. They're sworn to secrecy. And yet, when we speak about the ills of globalization, they come back at us and they say, oh, this is all conspiracy theory. Conspiracy theory, when you are going to meetings behind closed doors and you don't tell us what's going on. When we know that they are dictating policies, you can see all these policy papers, and you have elected leaders discussing with these globalists behind closed doors and then suddenly coming up with policies for the world. And that is a conspiracy. When we know that Klaus Schwab, as we said, has actually written this book. What is conspiracy?
That's right. And we don't even need to look that far, because if you look, for example, at EU funding towards its member states is also behind closed doors. Why is it behind closed doors? Those type of negotiations should be out in the open, so that the societies of the member states can see exactly what is being negotiated for those funds to be received.
Well, again, the more you have policies behind closed doors, the more people need to start banging on those doors.
Exactly.
I mean, let's face it, people really have to be naive if they think that things happening behind closed doors, like the trade treaties. I mean, everyone's talking about, our leaders are talking about increasing free trade, but I'm sorry, if you're increasing free trade, why are you discussing and debating trade treaties behind closed doors?
That's right.
Why do you end up having certain clauses within those treaties that are actually a major source of concern for free trade and for the sovereignty of nations? Because a company can take a nation to court for introducing policies that are not compliant with international trade agreements. And on the basis of that, a government elected by the people cannot introduce laws and policies. And we're thinking that there's actually sovereignty when these international trade agreements are giving more power to these companies. The same Committee of 300, the same globalists, the same club of billionaires.
It's actually interesting that you mentioned that, because a few years back in the U.S. Supreme Court had determined that a corporation was actually considered a legal person. And in that decision, the corporation was allowed to make contributions to political parties, act as a legal person. So it's the lines are being blurred between what is actually considered a corporation or a citizen. That type of legal distinction in the past is starting to become very blurred.
It is very blurred. Again, the democratic institutions are being unduly influenced by non-elected bodies. And it's a movement of power away from democratic institutions towards the organizations we spoke about, and unfortunately maybe the way things are going even within the European Commission, and also the way foreign policy has been going. Could we really say that foreign policy within Europe is actually European foreign policy, or is it being dictated by the globalists?
It's more of a global policy.
It's who's actually calling the shots. I mean, I remember only just a few years ago, Malta was already within the European Union, and there was a lot of talk about Europe holding its own and being in a healthy competition with other regions in the world, and trying to push peace policies and more trade. And now it seems to be rubber stamping things that are coming from decisions being taken by globalists.
Even if you look, for example, let's look at specific policies. For example, the legalization of marijuana. That's not a Maltese thing. That's not even a European thing. That's a global thing. The legalization of marijuana, for example, has been in the news and has been becoming legalized in many, many more nations over the last 15 to 20 years. Abortion, likewise. There's a movement towards where any country which still has abortion laws on the books, there's pressure now globally, not just in Malta, but in Philippines and over the last few years in many other countries, to get rid of those laws and to make abortion to legal across the board. And so these policies, you can see that they are not just localized. They are global in scope. You can see them. For example, a very short period of time, you'll have many nations talking about the same policies all at once. How is that possible if we are allowing these sovereign states to dictate their own policies? That wouldn't happen. You wouldn't have the same policy being discussed, through many states at the same time. It would be more scattered. You'd have one nation speaking about one law and one would be talking the opposite.
Yes, I don't believe in coincidence.
No,
I don't
absolutely.
think that the chips fall as they will, and suddenly they're all singing from the same
hymn book,
hymn sheet. All of a sudden, like they've all suddenly become enlightened and want to focus on the same policy at once. In fact, what's interesting, this had happened a couple of years ago now, just a few months into the whole COVID crisis, how top leaders, prime ministers and presidents, were suddenly using the same
script,
the same
talking points,
phrase.
Yep.
Let's build back better,
and always at the same time.
Yes, exactly. Within a matter of days, weeks. Where did this expression come from? It came from the World Economic Forum.
Exactly. And
it's a catchphrase, because listen, anyone who's into marketing realizes that when you have catchphrases,
it works.
It works, especially if you keep repeating and you bring new ideas in. Why is it suddenly we're all building back better, building back better?
And if every country was dictating their own health policy around COVID, you wouldn't have that happening, because one country would be doing one thing, another country would be doing another. But if they're all saying the same catchphrases, then it's quite obvious that this is a script which is coming from some higher level.
Somewhere else, yes. Not after an interesting debate in Parliament.
And it's not medical practitioners who are uttering these catchphrases. We're talking presidents and prime ministers. So something is happening. It's a coordinated effort, absolutely. I don't think it can be denied, really.
No, again, I mean, how could you, when you're using the same catchphrases? And why come out with a catchphrase of build back better? Isn't that, again, a reflection of this idea of a new world order or a new economic order? Why build back better? Okay, so we had a crisis with COVID.
Right.
Why suddenly...
They're conflating social economic policy with health. Yes.
Yeah. It's almost as though, well, we're going to start with a new slate now. Okay, so we had a crisis, a health crisis. Why are we talking about starting a...
It's almost like because we were dealing in capitalism and democracy, that brought in a virus. Like, how does... it doesn't make any sense.
No, doesn't make sense at all. Doesn't make sense at all. Well, I mean... just reminding people who might be tuning into us, feel free to pass any comments or questions. I think that the institutions... Oh, we have an interesting one here. How can we solve this issue? We're asked only to vote every 5 years. But how can we participate more in local decisions? Is this democracy, receiving orders from abroad, and obeying blindly as a country? Okay, very interesting question. So when we talk about democracy, we have what we call direct democracy or participatory democracy, and democracy, which actually is how it transpires in most countries in the world, you can say all of them, which is representative democracy. So rather than taking decisions as a people, we are taking a decision every 5 years, every 4 years, to elect people who would represent us. And that's called representative democracy. Representative democracy is no doubt very, it's very limited, because we as individuals are not participating in the decision-making process. The decision-making process is happening at a higher level. As we said, there are all these meetings going on. Of course, the lobbies in Washington, D.C., in London, in Brussels are enormous. There are thousands of people who are professionally paid to lobby on behalf of large companies, large corporations. Lobbying for what? To influence legislation, to influence policies. And whom are they influencing? They're not influencing us as voters in a direct democracy where we can vote on legislation, or at least some types of legislation. No, they are trying to influence our representatives. Okay. So this is not a healthy democracy. But unfortunately, it's got worse, because rather than tackle the issues and the limitations of so-called representative democracy, because it's very limited in democratic scope, we're actually getting worse. We're moving backwards now. Because even our representatives seem to be so beholden to these international organizations, meeting behind closed doors, discussing trade policies and trade treaties, discussing so many other policies where it happens to be regarding the environment, regarding health, and so on and so forth. And we are basically kept out of the picture completely in the discussion stage and in the policy making stage.
Yeah, I think Hunter S. Thompson rightly said that democracy is not is not a spectator sport. It's a participant sport. So I would possibly recommend for people to get involved. You know, start at the grassroots level. Get involved, for example, in school, in your child's school. You know, take part in the what's the word I'm looking for? When the committee for your school governance, for example. Start at that. Start at the local level as well. You know, get involved in local councils. Join a political party if you feel that it's important to you. If you can't find a political party
NGO.
or an NGO, and if you can't find one that you agree with, get together and start a new political party, start grassroots. I think these small changes, even for example, just the fact that you are vocal, post on Facebook, post on WhatsApp, don't be shy, don't be intimidated to speak up. These grassroots efforts can really make a difference. Especially if we start within local councils and small governance at schools and things like that, we can make big change.
I think it's essential. I think if people start to become more active, there might be hope that we could save and salvage the democratic structures. If we don't, we'll lose them. I mean, it's always been the case.
Always.
I mean, was it not Napoleon who said that power is never given, it's taken.
It's taken.
And power has been gradually taken from the people. Ever since the democratic process had started. There's a power grab away from the democratic process. We need to fight back to regain that power, to become more democratic, because otherwise we reach a stage where it's too late.
And we also need to become more independent. We need to become less dependent upon our governments. For example, start growing your own food, take control of your own livelihood. These things are important, because the more power, the more dependence we apply or we give to our governments, the more control they have over us, and therefore we bound ourselves.
Absolutely, but it reminds me of the days when, rather than the democracy that we have today, there were kings and queens who had considerable power, just a few generations ago. And they didn't refer to citizens then, they were referring to subjects. My subjects, our subjects. Why were persons being referred to as subjects? Because you are being subjugated to the king.
That's right.
Or the queen. You are their subjects.
Subject to their dictates.
Subject to their dictate, to their authority. And in a sense today, with the nouveau riche, the merchant class, the business tycoons, the globalists, they use the word consumer. So we were subjects and not citizens. And today we are just consumers and not citizens. And now, if they see that those consumers, because what is a consumer? We're going back to the eaters. No? We're not talking about physically eating food only. We're talking about consuming all sorts of products. But if those consumers are suddenly not going to have the financial resources to continue consuming, then they become useless consumers, or rather inactive consumers, because they don't have the financial power to continue consuming. So then they become useless.
Yep. They become a strain on the state.
And this is where it's leading. This is why people really need to, I believe, wake up and start becoming more engaging in what's happening. Because people have become, as a global society, we've become too passive. Way too passive. We tend to grumble and complain, but we're very passive. And I don't think we are realizing that what Napoleon had said, that power is taken and not given. We're not realizing how much power is being taken away from us.
Absolutely.
Yes, people feel disenfranchised, but essentially we're not, in a sense, resisting this change, which is going to be a very negative change for us.
And this dovetails into, we have another comment here, it dovetails quite nicely into this comment, and this is regarding the CBDC, or central bank digital currencies. Do you want us to speak a little bit to that, about how...
Well, maybe we could leave it for another episode.
All right, we'll leave it for another episode.
Actually, we could wind up here on this particular topic. But we could also go live on another episode, which we could actually talk about the World Health Organization.
It's quite a deep subject.
That's, of course, another international organization, which is, it's a governmental structure. It's not a governmental structure. We'll talk about that in the next episode. So please stay online, take a little break, as we would do too, and we'll be back on live very shortly with our next episode. Thank you.